retired from the Pontiac Police Department. He was a fellow police officer. Why would someone want to attack this family, attack his wife? He was very forthcoming. I asked him if there was any guns or anything that he had. He stated the only gun was a shotgun in the laundry room, and it was broken down during the search. We found the .22 caliber shell in the barn. We didn't find a .22 caliber rifle, but yet we found .22 caliber shells and a wood case made for a .22 rifle with the cleaning rods in it. Kind of odd that he would have those and not have the rifle. Brad King advised that he had went for a long walk back on the property, and when he returned, he found Diane laying in the driveway next to the vehicle.
True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
It was a quiet morning in rural Michigan. A beloved television personality was gunned down in her own driveway. So at first it seemed like a stalker's obsession had finally turned deadly. But as investigators dug deeper, the truth was actually much more sinister. The man she trusted most, the man she had vowed to love forever, was hiding his true character behind a mask of lies. Diane Newton King, mother, wife, and rising TV news personality, never made it to the inside of her home that day. Her children never had another moment with their mother. Join us for Behind the Veil, the murder of Diane Newton King. Behind the wedding vows, the smiles, and the years of building and sustaining a family, there lurked a dark truth which really threatened to destroy everything. So this is not just a story about murder, it's a story about trust shattered, love twisted, and the frightening question, how well do we really know the person we share our life with, Dickie?
You know everything about me.
You're an open book.
I am.
All right, so what beer do you have in your book this morning?
We've got a beer that I just recently had called Junie. It's brewed by Transient Artisan Ales in Bridgman, Michigan. Now, this is a very, very nice American Imperial Stout. A little bit heavy at 11.5% alcohol by volume. So we will sip this one. Dark brown, tiny, tiny head. Great aroma. We got some caramel, chocolate, and some sweet fruit that I couldn't identify just on the aroma. But taste told me that it was cherries. Also caramel milk chocolate. Maybe a hint of coffee, I wasn't sure. This is a wonderful stout. Nice, probably a nice dessert stout. Again, sip it and enjoy it.
It really sounds good. What was that beer we had that tasted like cheesecake with cherries on top? That was my favorite beer. Yeah. It was McKellar. Yeah. This one came in a little snifter. People were eating oysters, which of course we weren't. And it was the most incredible thing I've ever drank. It must have been cherry, because it tasted exactly like you were eating a piece of cherry cheesecake. But I'm just saying that was incredible. So let's open it and try it. See, it's got that nice, sweet, kind of fruity, chocolatey aroma. Yeah. I don't smell the coffee, but I do smell a lot of chocolate and cherry.
Yeah, it tastes like one of those chocolate-covered cherries.
Chocolate-covered cherry, absolutely. And it's almost the same color. So incredible, perfect for this chilly time of year. So I am going to enjoy this one as we talk about this case, which I learned about a few years back. I actually watched the trial a while back because it was televised on court TV, and it was really fascinating. Quite a shame. This was a really nice woman, nice family, and the husband turned out to be just kind of a shitball, which is always disappointing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is.
Okay. Well, come on down to the quiet end. Bring that beer if you don't mind.
Of course.
Okay. So let's go to July 21st, 1984. Diane Newton married Bradford King in the First Unitarian Church of Denver. Diane wore a white blouse, a white satin skirt, and a silk jacket. Brad wore a white dinner jacket and dark pants. His tie and cummerbund were lavender to match Diane's bouquet of lavender orchids. They'd written out their own vows. He said, "Today and always, I choose you to be the one I stand beside in life. You are the one I will love, support, and serve as we grow and expand in our aliveness." So I think that sounds kind of like bullshit. Aliveness? Really? I think he stole that. Because
Yeah,
I don't think he was very poetic.
It sounded to me like he was just kind of trying to boast about how good a speaker he was.
Yeah, it does sound a little phony that way. Now she said, "I pledge myself to having this marriage be magical and fun, inspiring, fulfilling, so that at the end of my life I can know that because of your love and support, I went far past my dreams." So that's a little haunting because we know the end of her life was not like that at all.
No, it wasn't.
We know that the end of her life came far too soon. So their first child, Marlar, was born March 6, 1988, and 4 years after the marriage in Grand Junction, Colorado. This was after Diane had established herself as a local star TV reporter at KJTC TV. So they'd named their boy after Diane's late father, Herbert George Marlar, in case you were wondering, because it is an unusual name.
It is.
She also gave herself a new name, taking the surname of her stepfather, Royal Newton. So Diane Newton King sounded like a contemporary and authoritative name to her. She liked it. Both Diane and Brad wrote letters to their new baby in a memory book. So everything just seemed great. Starting out great, right?
You're doing well.
Marlar was baptized in a Catholic church, and Diane, who was half Mohawk, was learning about her Native American roots. Brad had studied the ways of the Lakota and other Western tribes. They decided that they would meld Native spirituality into the Catholic ceremony. So they smudged everyone who watched with burnt offerings of the sacred medicines of cedar and sweet grass. Then, after the baby had been christened, everyone circled them. Brad held Marlar up, presenting the child to his elders. So pretty dramatic, huh?
Yeah, must have been a show.
So they named their second child, who was a girl, Kateri. She was born on November 20th, 1990. Diane and Brad had moved to Michigan, settling in a farmhouse just outside the Marshall city limits. So Brad was working as a criminal justice instructor at Western Michigan University. Diane was the morning anchor at WUHQ Channel 41, the only TV station with news located in Battle Creek. So they planned more blending of Native tradition and Catholic ritual for Kateri's christening. That was scheduled to be held at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Marshall, Sunday, February 24th, 1991 at 11 a.m. But on Saturday, November 9th at 6:49 p.m., a call came into the Marshall Police Department on the unrecorded line. So that meant the caller had just dialed 0 and the operator had transferred him through. The caller, Bradford King, was both crying and yelling at the same time. The dispatcher on duty tried to make sense out of the hysteria. The man was saying something about his wife, that she was on the ground near her car. He found her there after coming back from a walk, he said. The operator dispatched a Marshall firefighters ambulance unit from the fire hall just south of town. Deputy Guy Picketts heard the call from the handheld radio he'd taken with him into his house. The address piqued his interest as much as the call because he knew the address quite well. Pickett sped west past a rescue unit in the first block and saw the ambulance in his mirror. The view out the cruiser's front window changed quickly to small bungalows, an old canning plant, and light industrial buildings. After the Kalamazoo River Bridge, the horizon flattened. Picketts raced past a golf course. As he turned west onto Division Drive, only a dozen houses lined that mile-long road. All but 3 of the homes were on the north side. And the King House at 16240 Division was actually on the south side. So the deputy turned left into the 200-foot-long driveway, scanning the yard as he drove up the slight incline. The Victorian barn was on his left, and outbuildings and a cement silo were straight ahead. A tan station wagon was parked just beyond the barn. A silver Jeep Wagoneer was parked in the part of the driveway that turned off toward the house. The Wagoneer's grill faced the side porch entrance. The passenger side faced the deputy, and Pickett saw a body as he passed the Jeep and parked. Diane King was 2 feet from the Wagoneer's left rear tire. She lay on her back with her legs folded under her at the knees. Her dark straight hair was spread around her head on the gravel. Her arms extended over her head with her palms face up. As he approached the scene, Pickett saw and heard a young boy. Sounded like a preschooler. He was miserable, crying himself to exhaustion. He was in a child seat in the back seat of the Jeep, his upper body restrained. Next to him, in a smaller car seat, there was an infant. She was silent, but alive. Pickett fell to his knees next to the woman. She was in blue and white running shoes and powder blue lounge pants, with a gray Operation Desert Shield sweatshirt. So Pickett noticed a smear of frothy blood near one nostril. He put his fingertips on the carotid area of her neck. Her skin was soft and smooth and still warm, but there was no pulse. Muffled shouting was coming from inside the house. Pickett got to his feet and walked toward the noise, about 30 feet away. He saw movement then beyond the porch, inside the house itself, in the dining room area. A second door on the porch, one that led to the kitchen, was open, so Pickett could see the figure of a man silhouetted on the porch. "Help her," the man shouted. "Help my wife." Pickett tried to make some kind of identification, but it was all happening so fast. The Marshal Rescue Unit had pulled to a stop in the driveway behind him. Pickett turned and pointed out the body to 2 emergency medical technicians as they ran from the ambulance, one carrying a duffel bag of emergency equipment. And the rescue unit later logged its time of arrival at 6:54 p.m.
An EMT dropped his duffel bag as he fell to his knees at Diane's side. The other EMT started searching for a pulse, but found nothing. But found none. Then the other EMT tried. Then he thought he heard a breath, maybe one faint last breath. An EMT ran back to the ambulance to get an intubation kit and a defibrillator. The other EMT cut open her sweatshirt, pulled it back, and exposed her white bra and the skin of her upper chest. Pickett was heading to the porch as Brad stepped out the door and out to the sidewalk. The EMT called out to Pickett that his wife had been shot. Pickett was heading to the porch as Brad stepped out the door and out to the sidewalk. The EMT called out that she had been shot. Pickett headed back to the body on the ground and shined his flashlight on her chest. There was a 1/4-inch hole just to the right of her sternum, and a drop of blood oozed from the wound. One of the paramedics was intubating her. The deputy turned around and approached Brad again. He asked, and Brad identified himself, and he also identified the victim as his wife, Diane.
Yeah, so Brad stood motionless with his arms hanging at his sides. He stood on the sidewalk just off the porch, about 25 feet or so from the body. Pickett would get a good look at him a little later and decided that he was an odd-looking fellow. He was wearing boots, green camouflage pants, and a loose camouflage shirt. His head was covered with a wide-brimmed hat of red felt, and a blue jay feather poked out from its band. So that's quite a picture.
Rather eclectic, huh?
Yeah. 3 county cars and 2 Michigan State Police cruisers were headed toward 16240 Division Drive within 5 minutes of the first dispatch. Pickett needed a lot of help. He didn't know if the shooter was still on the property, and he knew very little about the man near the porch. So in seconds, a medical emergency had turned into a crime scene that needed to be secured. A third EMT parked his truck on the road and ran across the lawn to the house. He tried to run past Brad King, who was sitting on the porch steps. The EMT thought a heart attack victim was inside. Brad King stopped him, saying, "You can't go in there." So King pointed to the Wagoneer, which had blocked the EMT's view of the scene. They were working quickly, trying to save Diane's life. When Pickett heard an EMT say something about transporting the victim to the local hospital, the deputy ran to his squad car and then returned with his camera. The deputy took 6 photos, horizontal and vertical views taken a few steps back from the victim's feet. A leather key wallet lay less than a foot from her legs in the gravel. Nearby there was a leather hairband. The deputy's small flash reached 20 or so feet into the scene. not deep enough to show Brad King, who was standing back there in the dark. One of the EMTs pulled down Diane's waistband, revealing a small caliber bullet wound a half-inch above the pubic hairline. One shot could have been an accident from a hunter nearby because there was a lot of woods around, but 2 gunshots confirmed that this was a murder. The shot to the chest was determined to be the first impact, so it seemed like the killing may have been quite personal. The killer had fired once from above and then moved closer and lower before firing again. The crime would be recreated by investigators using a laser to confirm that the barn was where the killer was when he shot her. The angle was consistent with her wounds. So the 2 state troopers were approaching the porch now, where they found Brad King sitting on the steps. And he was no longer wearing that snazzy hat. His head was smooth and shiny, the style of a balding man who decided it was easier to just shave what he had left than try and do the comb-over. They noted later in their official report that King's face was in his hands, and that it appeared he was crying. An officer later recalled first seeing Brad King pacing between the kitchen door on the porch and the sidewalk just below the steps.
King said he had been out walking earlier. When he returned, he found his wife lying next to the car. Walking where, they asked him. He answered, back in the fields. King then motioned to the acreage south of the barn and the house. At 7:04 p.m., a 3rd county car turned into the driveway. The car that had been patrolling near the At 7:04 p.m., a 3rd county car turned into the driveway, the car that had been patrolling near the county's border. Back at the body, one of the paramedics succeeded in the 2nd attempt at intubation. A respirator filled Diane's lungs with oxygen, but she failed to breathe on her own. One paramedic went to the ambulance to notify the hospital and marshal of the victim's condition. They wanted the emergency room ready for her arrival. CPR continued. EMTs put a headboard under her, then lifted her onto a stretcher. Now this dislodged her breathing tube, so she had to be reintubated. And they noticed that there didn't seem to be that much blood. Considering that she was a victim of a gunshot wound or wounds, they would expect more.
Yeah, although I don't think there was an exit wound for both of them. The penetration was small caliber, so they didn't see any exit wounds. Some blood did run from the corners of her mouth and down her cheeks, and also to the collar of her sweatshirt. It was coming up her trachea from an internal wound near her lungs. Now finally, paramedics strapped her onto a stretcher and carried her to the waiting ambulance. Inside, 2 paramedics continued CPR. So now it was 7:08 p.m., 20 minutes from the first police dispatch, 14 minutes since the ambulance had arrived at the King house, and Diane's children were still in her car. Pickets and another officer met near the Jeep as Diane was being moved to the ambulance. Pickets kept looking at the big red Victorian barn. The exterior was well lit by 2 motion-detecting floodlights that were mounted under the eaves of the house. Below was the main barn door, which was wide open. There was a closed double loft door above the entrance, surrounded by 3 double-hung windows. To the right of the main entrance was another section, the barn's stable area, that was sheltered by another roof line. The white stable door on the first level was closed, but then Pickett's looked higher. He pointed out that the loft door was the sliding kind and it was trimmed in white, and this door was open slightly. Someone would later measure this open space at just 7 inches. The barn was not lit, so they had to use their flashlights. They moved forward slowly and found a tractor, garden tools, and plastic tarps. A black mule plow harness hung on the wall, and beneath it there was a young Doberman pinscher sleeping in some straw. So that was weird.
Some watchdog.
So upstairs the air smelled old and dusty. The floor was scattered with straw and dust. Pickett approached the open loft door and saw a mound of straw in front. He walked slowly forward, sweeping his flashlight in front of his feet. Then something shined back at him in the straw. A spent .22 caliber casing was poking upwards out of the strands of straw. So his idea to check the barn was right on. And of course, we think if the dog's not reacting, maybe there was no break-in or something. What's going on here?
Maybe it was someone the dog was familiar with.
Could have been. So right after Diane was removed from the driveway, King approached Officer Harold Badger on the sidewalk off of the porch. Badger would later recall asking him some questions. Do you have any weapons on you? King said he had a shotgun, but it was broken. He gestured toward the house. King's boots were clean and shiny. The kids were still in the back of the car. King asked if he could get them, and the officer told him to go ahead. So inside the house, King asked to make a phone call. He wanted to call someone to care for the children. He wanted to be with his wife in the hospital, he said. So he called a couple in Battle Creek, some friends of the family, and they said they would be there as fast as they could. An officer sat on the living room couch with Brad King, eyeing the interior of the home. The farmhouse was nicely furnished, patterned rugs across the hardwood floors, and the windows had colorful valances in southwestern patterns, distinctly Native American in design. King explained that he had spent a dozen years as a cop himself in the Pontiac Police Department just north of Detroit. At Western Michigan University, he taught criminal justice classes, so he knew a fair amount about murder investigations. At 8:17 p.m., the phone rang and King answered. It was Frida Newton, Diane's mom. She wanted to know if Diane had made it home from Detroit safe, and Brad King told her there's been an accident.
At 7:20 p.m., the couple King had called earlier for help with the children arrived at the farmhouse. Barb had known Diane King for 8 months. Her 2 children had played with Marlar. Later, she would recall the scene she found that night. I walked in the house. There were 2 police officers in the dining room area. There was one on his way out. There was one in the kitchen with Brad, and the children were sitting on the couch. Now, the first thing I did was look over. The first thing I saw was Marlar and Kateri. I heard them before I even got up to the door. Marlar was in shock. He was sitting on a couch just staring. Brad was preparing a bottle. Kateri looked like she'd been crying for quite some time. So Barb looked at Brad King, and the first thing she thought was, is he in shock? The children were by themselves. There was nobody in there with them. Her first instinct was to go to the children. King looked at her, and that's when he started to cry. She walked over and said, "What happened?" He just said, "Oh, Barb." Barb and her husband then took the 2 kids so Brad King could focus on his wife and talk with the police.
Well, there'd been an odd complaint from Diane and Brad King just a couple of months before the shooting. Someone had left a letter in their mailbox. It had not gone through the post office, so someone had hand-delivered it. And this really scared Diane, because she had a stalker, and now the stalker knew where she lived. This disturbing note Diane had received was now stored in a police evidence room. The note had lots of cut-out letters going in many directions. Letters of varied sizes and styles and type. The placement was erratic, and Scotch tape was holding down the letters onto the paper. This kind of letter is mostly a thing that you would see on TV or in a movie. In actuality, only about 1% of threatening letters are put together with cut-out letters.
Well, it takes time to do that.
Yeah, and it's almost kind of silly. So it read something quite simple. You should have gone to lunch with me. There was one fingerprint on the corner of the page, but it was still unidentified. As far as investigators knew, one of the deputies on the road had picked up the note after Diane had called the police department the night before Halloween. She told the police that she had found it in her mailbox. She explained that she had started getting calls at Channel 41 in the spring from a man who sounded like he was in his 20s or 30s. He said his name once, but she never got it again and forgot what it was. He spoke slowly and deliberately, like a mental patient on medication, she said. The guy wanted to know how to get into the business, about schools, training, and things like that. She told him to check out a community college, but he kept calling her, sometimes as many as 3 times a week. The receptionist at the station then started screening her calls. But then, at the end of summer, he somehow got through to her desk again. He told her he liked the way she looked. He wanted to go to lunch with her. And that's when Diane politely just told him, "Fuck off." I don't know how you say that politely, but...
I don't know either.
But She had to do something. He just wasn't getting the hint, it seems like. Now, Diane was 9 months pregnant when she got the letter, so she was scared shitless. The note was not postmarked, so she figured he must have followed her home. The note was sent over to Battle Creek City Lab for latent prints, but they weren't able to connect the letter to Brad or anyone else forensically. About 6 weeks later, investigators were back at the King's place. This time they talked to Diane King's husband, Brad. He had reported an attempted B&E at the house earlier that day. They sat down and talked for about an hour. King was home alone, and they traded some stories. King said he had put in a dozen years himself at the Pontiac PD. So they had taken some security precautions at work and at home since that letter was received. They had a Doberman, and the police seemed to be giving the complaint the appropriate priority according to King. They were working on it, but Diane did not really seem that extremely concerned at that point. Of course, she was very busy with her career and her family, so she did set aside some of her fears as much as she could. That's the only way she could function.
At around 8:30, on the night Diane was shot, she was pronounced dead. She was only 34 years old. So this was now a homicide investigation. Diane had been declared dead on arrival, minutes after she was taken into the emergency room. As police worked on getting a warrant to search the King home and property, one officer was tasked with giving the bad news to her husband. Well, I think he probably had an inkling of that anyway.
Yeah, he likely did. It may have even been his goal.
Brad, they worked on her real hard out there, the officer said. I know, Brad, King said. He buried his face in his hands, resting his elbows on his knees. It took some time to find anyone to come to King's side, but finally some people from the First Presbyterian Church in Battle Creek were on their way. King was motionless on the couch. He was taken to police headquarters in Marshall for a taped interview.
So I think it's kind of strange that he didn't insist on going to the hospital. And when they came, he wasn't at her side either. So investigators believed that they had found the spot up in the loft where somebody had fired a round. There was a shell casing in the barn loft, and the husband, Brad, had told them that he was on the property out back, and he found the body when he returned. No one had gone farther than the cement silo about 50 yards south of the barn to protect the area from contamination. So the Canine Department officer was counting on the dog's talent to track things when German Shepherd Travis and he went over to the .22 caliber casing in the straw. Figuring a gun ejects to the right, he pointed his hand to the left of the casing and gave the dog the command, track. The shepherd's nose went down and his ears and tail went up. He pulled the officer out of the loft and down the stairs. At the bottom of the stairs, the Doberman in the tack room started barking. But why hadn't the dog barked earlier if there was a stranger in the barn shooting at Diane? The police canine unit's German Shepherd Travis stopped momentarily, then kept going, pulling out of the barn door. He pulled for 7 feet, then turned straight south, heading down the lane that led from the barnyard toward the cement silo. When the dog pulled past the silo, the officer began thinking about the husband. He wondered if the husband had been in the barn for some reason, and how far south he had actually walked. At the silo, somebody in command had called them back. Travis, though, was still pulling hard. The dog stalked a variety of surfaces. In shadowed areas or in open ridges, some snow still covered the ground. And about 250 yards from the barn, they came to a creek. The stream was noisy and fast, to the point where it had carved new paths for itself around an old culvert. A fallen utility pole and a plank worked as a makeshift bridge across the gap. Travis pulled across the plank. On the utility pole where it met the south bank, the handler saw a heel impression. Remnants of water, ice, and mud outlined a ripple pattern on the pole's wood. Over the creek, Travis pulled slightly southeast for 10 yards or so, into a marsh to the east where there was a small patch of snow. The officer's flashlight picked up 2 more footprints, and both appeared to be from a right boot. One was facing north and the other south. The deep heel impression left a horizontal pattern of a half-dozen thick serrated lines. He carefully stepped around the footprints. The dog pulled due south into an area of saplings and brush. There were more patches of snow, though, and more footprints. The mag light revealed the same heel pattern, but now they were all headed to the south. Out of a row of small trees the snow cleared, Travis pulled left and headed east. The dog began working on the edge of the farm's field. About 150 yards east, Travis then pulled northeast, following a deer trail into the marsh itself. And just inside the bog, there was another heel impression in one of the soft depressions. It did look similar to the sole that was seen earlier on that trail. So about 20 yards ahead, Travis pulled hard toward the stream. He had his head down near the water. Then the dog leaped and landed in the middle of the stream, which was about 8 feet wide. His tail and his ears were up. He tracked northeast out of the marsh, then north across a wide open field. So they came out of the field near a small Michigan Gas Utilities pipeline station and took a left. When they approached the driveway to 16240 Division, the dog went straight for the entrance. So once inside the driveway, the German Shepherd's head came up. With patrol cars in the driveway and unmarked units parked along Division Drive, the dog's behavior presented a couple of possibilities. The person they were tracking could have jumped in a car at the foot of the driveway, or the area had simply become too contaminated with other scents. Or the killer had returned to the house after disposing of the gun. If the killer was not Brad, he would have had to pass by and seen the killer himself. So how do we feel about tracking dogs and their accuracy?
As far as I know, they are very accurate.
Well, I think a lot of it depends on the handler, right? Because a lot of it is up to your interpretation.
Right.
Yep. But yeah, I think they can do amazing things for sure. Especially the forensic dogs that find decomposing bodies. It's amazing what they can find.
No kidding.
After huge amounts of time pass.
Yep.
So this dog definitely seemed like he was onto something. His handler did feel sure of that.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to interpret what the animal did.
Well, we have to remember that Brad said he went out for a walk in the woods. So if we think that Brad was the shooter from the barn, Brad probably disposed of things out there. So if the dog went back around that water and through the woods and then ended up back at the entrance to the house, either the killer had to have gone in the house, which would point to Brad because we don't have any information about a stranger going inside the house, or Brad would have had to see the killer. So that was the really curious part of this. How did Brad get back to the house from his walk if the killer had come back to the house?
I see.
And seen nothing. That's very questionable. So Brad and a detective walked down to the squad room at the Marshall Police Station, and he was going there for his interview as the searching at the house continued. There was a table and a couple of chairs, and King hung his head in grief, rubbing his bald head with his hand. The detectives put a cassette recorder between them and turned it on. And then Brad told his story. He had gone out for a walk. He did not know what time, maybe 6 or a little after. He was at home alone. Diane and the kids were on their way home from Sterling Heights after visiting Diane's mom. They had left Thursday in the morning to visit Diane's mom. Diane was expected back to work on Monday. Her mother called Brad around 4:30 and told him that Diane and the kids were on their way home. So Brad said he'd been napping and decided to take a walk to wake himself up. He said he'd gone out around 6 and headed back home as it started to get dark outside. When he got back, he saw Diane lying beside the car. So his story is that she was already shot when he returned. He ran over, grabbed her, and yelled at her, but he said she did not respond. He said he heard a gunshot minutes earlier, but he'd really thought nothing of it because there were acres of land there, and it really wasn't that unusual for people to be out hunting small animals nearby. King had not heard a car speed off or anything else unusual, he said. When Diane's family didn't hear from Brad, they started to put together that he must have had a role in the shooting. Why wasn't he communicating with them? They finally called the police station, where they were handed over to Brad, and that's when he finally told them that Diane was dead. They'd just been waiting. So they really questioned Brad's story. They did not have the greatest opinion of him. Plus, he had known Diane didn't like coming home to an empty house, so why would he go off and take a walk when he knows she'll be there any time? Why wasn't he there to meet her? She had 2 little kids she would have needed help with. They wondered if maybe he had actually been Diane's stalker, and he had been the one making the harassing phone calls. For years, Diane had talked about Brad's best qualities and tried to minimize his standoffish and cold behavior. Diane, they always suspected, signed his name to any cards and letters sent to the family. Diane had been his best promoter, but face to face, Brad's true self could not be hidden. Nobody really was able to click with him. Maybe some of them never liked him because he was always right on Diane's tail, tagging along, nagging her, watching her all the time. Plus, Diane's family knew that Brad was not a good provider. They believed he was a sponge who packaged himself as some kind of modern man who helped around the house. He let Diane support the family, and he was also quite a liar, even though he always thought he fooled everybody.
The family was still trying to make sense of Brad's disappearing act a couple of weeks ago. Then, Diane was supposed to meet a camera operator from Channel 41 at the grand opening of an archery shop opened by rock star Ted Nugent on a Saturday afternoon. Brad took off to wash the car a mile up the road, but he disappeared for 2 hours. Diane was fuming. He finally called saying he had soaked the engine and stalled the car.
So is that even a thing?
Soaking the engine?
Yeah, I think you can wash an engine with water and it's fine.
Yeah.
Plus, if you're washing the car, why would that even be a thing?
Well, it shouldn't be.
No, it seems like a totally made-up story.
He wants to open the hood and wash the engine.
Oh, come on.
I'm just being stupid.
Well, he was being ridiculous. And nobody was believing his story.
So, after he called and said that he had soaked the engine, Diane went out to find him, and he wasn't at the car wash. When he returned, he said he'd go to a different one. No, it didn't seem to bother him at all that he'd messed up Diane's work assignment.
Yeah, and that was a pretty big assignment, I know. As someone who grew up in Michigan, Ted Nugent was a big deal back then. So the Battle Creek Inquirer ran a page-one headline after the shooting. TV anchor slain. Under it, friends report harassment. A staff writer had reached Diane King's former boss, KJCT-TV station manager Jan Hammer. He said he had talked to Diane King 2 weeks earlier. She'd told him she was being stalked. She had received calls and the cutout letter, but Diane's family now suspected that maybe her husband Brad had been behind the whole thing. Maybe he'd been plotting this all along. Brad's uncluttered work schedule had allowed him plenty of free time, and he would socialize outside the marriage. But that arrangement threatened to come undone because Diane wanted to quit her job and stay home with her 2 young children. So Brad decided on murder and insurance fraud instead of divorce and starting over. And he believed he could fool investigators. So this is what the family put together, and it seems quite accurate the more we learn. Police did search the King property, looking for the weapon that had killed Diane. They did find a rifle stuck down deep into mud in a creek, along with some shell casings. It looked like someone had stepped on the gun to drive it down into the mud and pushed it in as far as they could. And of course, this would have been on Brad's walking path that the dog had followed. The gun was found along the same track that the dog had followed, and the trail Brad King had likely walked. Brad's family identified the gun as being in their family and belonging to Brad. His mom was interviewed very reluctantly and said Brad was the one who had ended up with that gun. Of course, this was circumstantial evidence, but now they had family members who would testify that they believed that that gun was left to Brad.
Pick apart his story.
Absolutely.
A tip came late in the week of Diane's funeral. Kathy, an attractive college-age girl, checked into a local motel the day after the murder, made one phone call, then abruptly checked out. She told motel staff that she was a close friend of Brad King's, but wanted no contact with his family, who were staying in other rooms.
Yeah, so this was curious. Kathy was only 21, and she was a former criminal justice student of Brad King. I guess I just went to Marshall on an impulse, she would tell detectives, adding she had left after finding out that Brad had plenty of family around. She denied being his lover, but said that King listened to her problems and gave her rides home from class when her car broke down. He had dropped by her apartment to just chat, she said, before class a couple of times. In fact, she added, King had gone out with her and 2 other of his students just on February 7th, 2 days before his wife's murder. They'd gone drinking at a pub in Kalamazoo until about midnight. Kathy said he seemed a little down. He said things were a little more complicated in his life than he wished them to be. Detectives had to wonder why an instructor would go out drinking with his students. Seems very inappropriate. Also, he's got these 2 little kids and a wife. He should probably be spending more time with them.
That probably would be nice.
King said his wife watched their children at his house when he taught, and he told Kathy that he and his wife were separated, which was absolutely not true. So on February 19th, an anonymous caller to the police shared a similar story. Someone ought to have a chat with a couple of Western Michigan roommates, the tipster said, and they seemed to know all about an affair that Brad King was having with a student. Investigators found one of the students at home, and she said she knew all about the affair. Her roommate was best friends with the student. From what she understood, she had been seeing King since the fall term. This student, Kelly, had been dreading hearing from the police for days. But she invited the detective into the kitchen. He was making her nervous, but she finally did admit to having sex with Brad King twice. So students described King as a big softy in class. They said he encouraged everyone to call him Brad. He seemed super easygoing. He gave students pats on the back and hugs. Students brought him small gifts and snacks. So he had himself a following, mostly young women. A half-dozen female students were always following him back to his office, something that did not go unnoticed by some of the men in class. As his students got to know him, they learned all about his marital troubles and his devotion to his son. He talked about wanting to take his son hunting, but said his estranged wife complained that that was no place for a 3-year-old. I'd have to agree.
Well, yeah, it's easy.
That's crazy. So he also liked to hit the bars after class, and in November, when he told some students that his estranged wife had given birth to their daughter, they'd asked to see a picture. But he'd been all thrilled about his son and seemed indifferent and cold about the new child, the daughter. The Channel 41 bookkeeper, Nancy Gwynn, knew that she also had to contact the police and share information with them. She was interviewed on February 21st. Ever since the funeral, Nancy had cried every day at 8:40 a.m., the time Diane King had always dropped by her office, taking her break over coffee and cookies that Nancy would bake and bring in. Nancy knew she'd become Diane's surrogate mother at the station, and recent months had brought uncertainty for everyone. The station was going to be sold in June, executives were telling them. Everyone was considering getting other jobs. But Diane really seemed to have more troubles in her life than most. She was having a really tough time making ends meet. And Brad just did not seem to understand. He just wanted more. Twice the IRS had started garnishments, and twice Diane had called them and promised payments to stop it. She told Nancy she'd given Brad money to pay these installments, but he'd never sent it in. He just spent it on himself. So he's just a real charmer, huh? Quite a guy, this Brad.
Yeah, he's a hard worker.
Yeah. So they talked a lot about her marriage. Nancy had seen Diane the Thursday before her murder, and Diane had done her fair share of crying in the office, week after week, ever since she became pregnant with Kateri. Brad wanted her to abort the baby, Diane told her. He never really wanted Marlar either, she added. Their marriage seemed to take a turn for the worse after they had kids. Diane told her recently that Brad was losing his temper with Marlar and slapping him around. He had lost his temper with Diane, too, and she had shown Nancy bruise marks shaped like fingers on her arms. Brad had also hit her in the stomach days before Kateri was born, Diane had told her. He would say to her, "I'm going to kill you, I swear to God."
You hear that, those statements, and you just feel badly that the woman couldn't extricate herself from that situation.
Oh, yeah, it's a tragic story, and unfortunately, it's one we hear too often.
Oh, we do.
Yeah. I mean, she just had that daughter. It's really in a tough spot. Plus, she's going to lose her job.
So when Diane returned to work at the station in January, she told Nancy that she suspected Brad was actually her stalker. She suspected he had faked a break-in at the house as well. I know it's Brad. He's trying to scare me, Diane said. The Thursday before the killing, during their last morning break together, Diane had an especially hard cry. I just can't do it anymore, Nancy, Diane told her. I'm done. I've tried everything I could try. I've tried to talk to him. I've tried to make him understand that the children are part of our lives. I've tried counseling. I can't live this way. Diane King told her she was going to contact an attorney. She wanted to get a divorce. Although media accounts vary on Brad's job status around the time of Diane's murder, one source reported that he was entirely unemployed by the winter of 1991.
Yeah, so he'd really gotten to the point of just using her and doing whatever he wanted. Just a real scumbag with 2 little kids. So by the end of February, detectives were wondering what it was going to take to get an arrest warrant from the prosecutor's office because they felt sure that Brad had killed his wife. They'd already put together a strong circumstantial case. For motive, the detectives offered a couple of possibilities. They had found a company life insurance policy on Diane at the TV station. The payoff with double indemnity would have been $54,000. Now, clearly, there was trouble in the King marriage, and after finding students he had had affairs with, both detectives thought the prosecutor would want to make an arrest. But the prosecutor did not think a jury would consider $54,000 a high enough motivation for murder. I disagree. This was 1991. So $54,000 is a lot of money now. Back then, it was a great deal of money. You could buy a house, a decent house, in 1991 for that money.
Yeah, well, it might not seem like a princely sum of money, but for some people it would be.
Well, for someone who's not working, yeah. So the prosecutor also argued that the students could have just been flings, and maybe that wouldn't be a motivation, because no one had said they were in love with him or demanding that he leave Diane, and he hadn't promised any of these women that he was going to marry them. So while investigators were still working on the case, Brad took his 2 children and moved to Colorado. He said he was tired of facing police questioning. Police conducted dozens of interviews. One young man who mowed the King's lawn told them that he had seen a .22 caliber rifle at the King house, that Brad did own one. Investigators had the rifle they found in the mud in the woods tested, and it was consistent with the gun that had killed Diane, but it could not be matched 100%. The bullets had been damaged from impacting Diane's body. Still, now they felt they had enough that they could get a conviction. So finally, in early 1992, Michigan authorities did arrest Brad. They charged him with first-degree murder and set his bail at $750,000, so he would remain in jail. At the trial, Diane's mother testified that Brad had expected Diane to be alone in the car when she returned home on the day of the murder. You see, the couple had planned to leave Kateri and Marler with their grandparents overnight. Brad had given some kind of story to her, like he wanted them to have time alone to work on things. But one of the kids had gotten sick, so Diane had ended up bringing them both home with her. So Brad was surprised to find his children in the car. So this could have been part of his downfall. He couldn't leave them in the cold for very long, so he had to hide the gun and shells quickly and rush back to the house and call for help. But in his hurry, he had missed one shell in the barn, and this, at least circumstantially, tied his rifle to the murder. Investigators believed Brad planted the rifle in the woods to deflect suspicion away from himself, and they suspected Brad sent the threatening note to Diane and had used cutout letters because she could have identified his handwriting. Authorities believed the entire stalker saga was a hoax that was staged by Brad. So one of the things they had to get past for this was to figure out how he had changed his voice. But there were such things as voice changers available at that time. Remember Home Alone 2? Kevin had that voice-changing toy.
Yeah.
You could buy those cheaply at Toys R Us.
Oh, sure.
So the defense suggested that a burglar had killed Diane. there was a broken window at the house, but the glass fragments were on the wrong side. They were outside of the house, and thieves, of course, break in, not out. So his setup there had failed. We've seen that in a few cases where they break the window from the inside out.
The wrong way.
Yeah. Actually, I think they did that in that really famous Texas case, the Katy, Texas case.
Yeah.
With Kelly Siegler as the prosecutor. I remember that. So Brad was 44 years old, and this is a guy who enjoyed hanging around with college kids at a fraternity house and liked doing shots of tequila at Waldo's, a bar where students drank. 2 students told police that they were having affairs with Brad shortly before the murder. One of these women, Ann Hill, said Brad felt cut off from the family's finances, and he had told her that Diane had frozen their checking account. So there's another motive if she's cutting off his money, right?
Can't do that.
No. Police did learn that Brad had set up a date with one of his girlfriends the day after the murder. So I guess he just thought he was smarter than the investigators and expected to get away with murdering his wife, but that just seems like you're just tempting fate to do something like that. Wasn't even really trying to look good.
It's pretty stupid, but there's other things.
Well, there's always stupid things, right?
Yeah.
Now, the prosecution believed that Brad had set up Diane. He knew that she was coming home, and he left the lights on in the house. Then he shot her from the barn with his rifle. As far as the stalker is concerned, the prosecution was now totally convinced that Brad King had made the calls and sent the letter, planning to murder Diane one day and hoping her murder would just be blamed on this unknown stalker. So after a 6-week trial, Brad King was convicted, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He's still serving his life sentence at the Gus Harrison Correctional Facility in Adrian, Michigan. So I definitely think this whole stalker thing, he had started the whole thing with this in mind eventually. Why else?
Oh, you have to think if he's going to the trouble of stalking her or agreeing with her that there was a stalker.
Yes, and contacting the police and reporting it.
He's got some underhanded business going on.
Yeah, I think it was definitely a setup, and then he just ambushed her. He thought she was coming home without the children, and he was in the barn just ready to kill her. It's very cold-blooded, very premeditated. It's really rotten. Just a real psychopath, if you ask me.
Yeah, he has some issues, doesn't he?
That's putting it mildly, yeah. But this just seems like a personality type we've seen many times in people that kill their wives. Sometimes also in women who kill their husbands. But it's almost like this attitude of not wanting to be an adult, not wanting to be responsible financially or with the children, just wanting to have a good time. And then when the spouse gets in the way of that, they really don't seem to have any qualms about just killing the spouse. So it's definitely a psychopathic personality and a narcissistic personality, I would think.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's just dreadful. Dreadful, dreadful. So word on the street is that you don't have any feedback for me today.
You heard correctly.
Okay, but next week, you're going to have just some really awesome feedback.
Yeah, well, I need some suggestions from people.
Oh, you need more suggestions?
So,
okay.
All you listeners out there, send an email or a voice message or however you can do it by carrier pigeon. Give me some suggestions so we can do feedback.
You really should, because just picture Dick sadly sitting at his desk. He keeps refreshing the voicemail page and nothing's there. Right?
Nothing
just keeps
new.
Refreshing. He says, I need more feedback so I can give it to my wife. She's just really giving me a hard time here. Poor Dickie.
Yep.
Yep.
Poor me.
Poor Dickie. Okay, guys. Well, thanks for listening. We appreciate you, and we await your feedback. We'll see you next time at the quiet end.
Come on down. Plenty of room.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.